Hello, Lucas Lowe. Today we're going to read Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. Oh, this one's difficult to open. Mr. Happy by Roger Hargreaves. On the other side of the world where the sun shines hotter than here, and where the trees are 100 feet tall, there's a country called Happy Land. There's Happy Land. Looks happy. And you might very well expect everyone who lives in Happy Land is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you'll see smiling faces all round. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happy Land. Look at the flowers smiling away. Isn't it lovely in Happy Land? And as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happy Land are happy as well. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, go to Happy Land. There's the worm smiling away. That one's difficult. This is a story about someone who lived there who happened to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy was fat and round and happy. There he is, Mr. Happy, smiling in the warm sun. He lived in a small cottage beside a lake at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood in Happy Land. There's his little house. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in those woods near his home, he came across something which is really rather extraordinary. There he is, walking in the woods. There, in the trunk of one of the very tall trees, was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless a door. Certainly a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. Definitely a door. I wonder who lives here, thought Mr. Happy to himself, and he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked and it swung open quite easily. There's Mr. Happy and the yellow door, opening the yellow door. Just inside the small, narrow yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway and began to walk down the stairs. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and down and down and round. I'm exhausted just thinking about it. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw that there in front of him, another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Here's Mr. Happy in the red door. Can you see him, Lucas? Mr. Happy knocked at the door. Who's there? Said the voice. A sad, squeaky sort of voice. Who's there? Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly, and there, sitting on a stool, was someone who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. There's the look-alike Mr. Happy looking miserable. Hello, said Mr. Happy. I'm Mr. Happy. Oh, are you indeed? Sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. Well, my name is Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world. Why are you so miserable? Asked Mr. Happy. Because I am, replied Mr. Miserable. There's Mr. Miserable with his sad face, and there's Mr. Happy with his happy face. How would you like to be happy like me? Asked Mr. Happy. I'd give anything to be happy, said Mr. Miserable. But I'm so miserable, I don't think I could ever be happy, he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. Follow me, he said. Where to? Asked Mr. Miserable. Don't argue, said Mr. Happy. and he went out through the small, narrow red door. There's Mr. Happy going out through the small, narrow red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated and then followed. Up the winding staircase they went, up and round and round and up and round and round and up until they came out into the wood. Follow me, said Mr. Happy again, and they both set off through the wood back to Mr. Happy's cottage. There's Mr. Happy and there's Mr. Miserable. Happy? Miserable. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time, and during that time the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happy Land, Mr. Miserable ever so slowly stopped being miserable and started to be happy. His mouth stopped turning down at the corners. There's his mouth. It's neither happy nor sad. And ever so slowly it started turning up at the corners. There's a little bit of an up at the corner there, isn't it? Oh, this page is tricky to turn. And eventually Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in his whole life, in the whole of his life. He smiled. And then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which then made him laugh. A big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. And both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. I can't even tell if that's Mr. Happy or Mr. Miserable, because now they've both got the same expression. Here they are laughing away. Mr. Miserable and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. They went outside and still they laughed. And because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds and the trees started to laugh at the thought of someone called Mr. Miserable who just couldn't stop laughing. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if you ever feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable, as Mr. Miserable used to, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn your mouth up at the corners, go on. And Katie's turning her mouth up at the corners. Good night, Lucas. Mr. Happy.